Well, last week, we had Jonah Dorlis from Haitian Christian Mission. He began his story with a story about a preacher who, he just preached too long. And so his wife came up with a solution by giving him a candy to suck on, and he knew that whenever his candy was gone, it was time for him to end the sermon. So we thought we'd have a little fun with that. It is Halloween. That's why we gave you a Tootsie Pop Rose as you came in. So I'm just going to challenge you. If you want to time my sermon, you're welcome to do so. You can have one of these. If you already ate yours, you can get another one. Unless you're one of those owl kind of people who only licks it 3 times and crunches it. So I'll probably preach a little longer than that. But just to let you know, I'm going to go by my own Tootsie Pop, and so I brought one to make sure that I would have plenty of time. And so you can have yours, and I'm going to have mine, and we'll get through this together. So it is always good to be with you guys, and I hope that you are in the spirit of things in our nation as we have sort of a happy Halloween. Today is Halloween. It is a day, at least for my perspective, of just getting to dress up and have some fun, to go knocking on some doors and receiving candy. And we're kind of glad that you are beginning that celebration with us, because we want to invite you to taste and see that the Lord is good. That's from Psalms 34:8. And He is sweeter than any candy that you're going to receive. And so we encourage you to kind of just enjoy some of the love, some of the mercy, some of the grace that God gives, and that is a sweetness that we need. Some churches don't celebrate Halloween at all. On October 31st, they celebrate Reformation Day. Reformation Day recalls how in 1517 Martin Luther nailed 95 ways onto the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg, how the Catholic Church needed to be reformed back to the truth of the Bible. He was still a part of that church at the time. He was just hoping to see it reform, but it was a pivotal moment that really sort of led to a church split. In protest over the issues that Martin Luther highlighted, a lot of people, and even ones they didn't mention, began to separate from the Catholic Church and begin to form their own churches. That's why they're called Protestant churches. They were protesting. And if you didn't know, we belong to that group of churches. We're also one of those Protestant churches. Our protest is that, everyone should be reformed back to the Scriptures, and so we need to study it. There are even other churches, rather than celebrating Halloween or Reformation Day, they celebrate All Saints Day, which is actually tomorrow, November 1st. And that's a day that's to remember all of the saints, whether they are celebrated or they have been forgotten. Of course, in keeping with Reformation, the word saint, at least the way it's used in the Bible, is a reference to every believer, not just those outstanding ones. Every person who puts their faith in Jesus. It was the early church's way, calling people saints, to remind one another that they are a person who's been transformed into a child of God, glowing with His holiness in their lives by His amazing grace. That's a good thing to celebrate as well. It really is a special day, and not for any of those reasons. But it is, as we started out, the day the Lord has made. And sometimes Sunday in some churches are referred to as the Lord's Day. It was on Sunday, that is the first day of the week, in which Jesus rose from the dead. And so we gather on this special day every week to worship our risen Lord. And part of the way we do that is to devote ourselves to the apostles' teachings, which are preserved in the letters and in the histories that were written and that were brought together into one book that we refer to as the New Testament. Now, Paul wasn't the only one who added to those by writing letters, and especially personal letters. John, the apostle, felt compelled to send this letter that we are beginning to study today to a lady and her children. We refer to this personal letter as 2 John. It is the second of the 4 one-chapter books in the Bible that we are learning that sometimes the gospel just gets personal. Some people would say that the gospel is an old preacher story. Whenever there were a couple of women who were sitting at the front row in a revival, they had gone there. They were ladies who loved being in the church. They loved the kinds of things that happened in the church. And they had this kind of fiery preacher who was preaching one of those old-fashioned fire and brimstone kind of sermons. And they were sort of really getting into the whole spirit of the thing. Whenever he started condemning the sin of lust, they got rather animated about it. I mean, they were saying, "Amen, brother, amen, preach it, preach the word." I mean, they were really getting this guy going, and so he just kind of camped out on that for a while. And after he stomped the dickens out of those lustful sinners, he started in on those who stole. And those ladies were just as vocal. They got super excited about it and their affirmations about it. And, well, he held those dishonest sinners over the very fires of hell for a while and just, really tried to scare them as much as he could into living right. And those ladies were just saying, bring it on, bring it on. And then he started talking about the selfish people in the church and how they just really encouraged him as he condemned those greedy sinners and how they kept things for themselves and never shared it with anyone else. And, they were encouraging him to condemn those guys, and he was doing it. And after he finally got through with those poor sinners, he started in on the gossips, and he started preaching about how those people were wagging their tongues and taking them at each other. And those ladies just sat down and got real quiet. And he couldn't understand what was happening there. They weren't giving him any affirmations at all when he was preaching about those terrible gossips who were wagging their tongue. And so he figured he just wasn't hitting them hard enough, and so he just went on more and just really beating up those gossips in the church. And then finally he decided, well, the reason they're quiet, they must just be tired. And if they're tired, everyone else is tired, so I ought to just go ahead and bring this sermon to a close, which he did. And afterwards, when he was shaking everyone out the church and finding them, he just asked those ladies, he goes, "Man, I thought you got into it, but then you just sort of stopped at the end. What happened?" They said, "Oh, yeah, we loved your preaching. We just didn't like that part when you went to meddling." These one-chapter books of the Bible are personal letters, and they do sort of meddle in people's lives. And there were probably those who first received these letters that really did think that the apostles had quit preaching and started meddling. Some preachers teach that the elect lady and her children was really a coded phrase to be understood as a reference to the entire church, making this a general letter to the general people of a church. But the overwhelming evidence is that this was a personal letter from John to a real lady who had real children. If you're interested in looking over that evidence, send me an email or a text, and I'll be glad to get with you and talk about it and study it. While I find that sort of detailed study rather fascinating, not everyone does, and so we're going to skip over that for now. But it may interest you that the Greek term that's translated lady here is the word Kyria, which is the feminine form of Kyrios. Which is usually translated as Lord. Lord was their common term for the head of a household. The Romans used it to describe their relationship with Caesar, and they would say that Caesar was their Lord. And the Jewish community used Lord as a substitute for God's name so they wouldn't inadvertently use it in vain. And the early Christians used Kyrios as a way to say that Jesus was their Lord and talk about their relationship with him. And because of how these early Jewish and Christian people used the term Lord, they refused to call Caesar Lord, and that got them in a lot of trouble, often persecuted by the Romans. They were seen as people who would not be civil because they wouldn't give their allegiance to Caesar. The feminine form that we have here in our text of Lord was used to sometimes identify the wife of the head of a household. They used it in the same way that Lord and Lady was used by the English aristocracy. They also used lady to refer to a woman who was the head of her own household. They don't go into explain why she was the head of the household, whether her husband died or whether she had created her own household, but they use this term to specify that kind of person. So I decided to take a little bit more in-depth look at this term lady as how it's used in the entire Bible. And so I searched through the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to see how the Greek word was used in the Old Testament. And I discovered that it was used to describe Sarah, Abraham's wife, as the person who was sort of second in command to her household. And it was also used to refer to the widow whose son Elijah raised from the dead. And it was used to talk about Naaman's wife. In fact, every place I found the word lady used, it was always in reference to a real woman who had real children. And that's the way the New Testament tends to use it as well. While John would have known this lady's name, and those in the early church would have known it as well, we don't know her name today. It's been lost to history. It's sort of like finding one of those old stacks of family photos, and you go through there and you see those people and you know you're related to them or wouldn't be in the stack of old family photos, but you have no idea who those people are. Perhaps the people who took the photo, or perhaps your great-great-grandmother or someone back there might know, and they may have passed that name along, but a lot of those names have been lost along the way, and that's how this woman was as well. When I was thinking about that, I was thought of an old family photo that I have that was sent to my great-grandmother. It was sort of a postcard kind of a photo. It showed my ancestors standing on the front porch of a shack with their shotguns out beside them, and all the men with these great big beards. And I just thought, man, I come from good stock. And on the card, even though it was sent to my great-grandmother, all it addressed her at was hi, cuz. And it was spelled C-U-Z, which made me go, yeah, I come from some good guys. They never mentioned her name. But because I know the story and I know my great-grandmother's name, I know her name. And so I just wanted to affirm in that way that even though in the Bible we don't know this lady's name, we do know that she was an important lady that John felt he needed to write a letter to. He does describe her as being a chosen lady or an elect lady. John used the word that gets translated chosen and elect that also gets translated in other places as church. It's the word ecclesia. In other places, it might even be indicating that John is sort of referring to her as the church lady. She's the one who's associated that way. You know, even today there are ladies who are sort of pillars of the church. Their identity is so tightly woven with the church that it's sometimes hard to think of the church without thinking of that woman who has such an influence in it. It's sort of the way that we used to think of Lois Rayburn, with her and her husband who established this church back in 54. There for a long time, it was sort of hard to think about this congregation without thinking about her and all the things that she did. Regardless of how you want to understand John's description of this lady, at the very least, it indicates that she was a very important woman in the church. I want to pause just a minute, and I want to affirm that there were very important women in the early church. Paul even talked about them as being fellow workers in some of his letters. Some of them were described as being prophetesses. Others were described as being the wives of the heads of households in which a church met, like Aphia, whom we met in our study of Philemon recently. Others were the wives of church leaders like Priscilla, who along with her husband Aquila taught Apollos more perfectly in the Lord, that is, taught him about Jesus in a way that he had not yet known so he could respond to Jesus in a better way. And there were women like Lydia, who was the head of her own household, and in whose house Paul stayed at when he was in Philippi trying to establish a church there. And it was probably in her household that that church began to meet. She and the women who comprised her household were the first converts in Europe. There was also Phoebe, who was described by Paul at the end of the book of Romans as a deacon of the church in Cranchia. So I just wanted to point out there really were some important ladies in the early church, just as there are important ladies in our church. He greeted this lady in nearly the exact same way that he greeted Gaius in 3 John, which we'll study next. John even expressed the same kind of love for her that he said he had for Gaius. I think it's important to point out that John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, did not withhold his feelings toward this lady. John states very plainly that he loved her in truth. Some say in the truth, but it just says in truth, as did everyone else who knew the truth. She was someone that when you met her, you loved her. She was just that kind of an influential lady. You may notice that John uses the word in truth a lot in this section of this letter. The first truth indicates that John really did love her. He wasn't just complimenting her. He wasn't just saying that he loved her. John really loved her in truth. The second truth, the one that everyone knew, was the truth about Jesus. We might call this sort of knowing the gospel truth today. And then there is the third use of truth in these 2 verses at the beginning of this letter. That is the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Which is sort of a reference to the kind of change that takes place in every person when they accept Jesus as their Lord, and then the hope that we share and the transformation that takes place in our life. We have that truth in our lives, and it's going to be with us forever. It's more than something that we have learned. It's now a part of who we are and our identity. I think that John was emphasizing truth in so many different ways, because he wrote this letter to this lady because she was being deceived. We won't get to all the details about how exactly she was being deceived until we get into next week's study that covers the second half of this letter. But I want you to notice that the first thing that John does in this letter is to offer this lady and some of her children a blessing. I don't think it was just a requirement of how he wrote letters that he had to include this, because you don't find it in all of his letters. I think that John really wanted her to experience some things from the Lord that she wasn't at that time experiencing. He asked that she receives the blessing of grace and mercy and peace, which implies that she and the church to which she belonged weren't experiencing them. I mean, why doesn't a church experience those kinds of things? Usually because there's some sort of turmoil going on in church. Like I said, John in this letter is kind of getting personal with the gospel. He's not going to let this turmoil go on without it being addressed, and he's talking specifically to the lady who's involved in it. In times of turmoil, we crave those kinds of blessings in our life because we're not experiencing it, and we want His grace, we want His peace in our lives. We need them. And how amazing is it to receive them from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, His Son, that He sees us and He gives us exactly what we need. How even more amazing is it that John points out that they were given to this woman and her children in truth and in love. There's that word truth again. John openly shares with this lady that he was delighted to discover that some of her children were continuing to walk in the truth. And that word walk, peripateo, just means to live in the truth. Just as everyone who follows Jesus has been commanded to do. Sometimes we can get caught up on the command part, but I want you to recognize that John is using here yet truth in another different way. This time he's talking about how coming to know Jesus as Lord changes the way we do, as Paul so clearly explained in the 13th chapter of Corinthians, is to be based in love. if we are not acting out of love, what we do, even if those things we do are good things, don't matter in God's eyes if we're not doing it because we don't love in truth. We might do good things to tolerate people, but we're supposed to love. It also implies that some of this lady's children held on to the truth and some didn't. Those who held on to the truth were living lives of love. He was glad to hear that some held on to the truth. Some were still living lives of love. Some were still living as they were supposed to. And I guess that if you got this, it would be good news that some of your children were still living the right way. It implies that this lady had other children who weren't. She had some other children who weren't loving, weren't holding on to the truth. And it also implies that perhaps this lady herself wasn't living by the truth, wasn't living in a loving way. Can you imagine the problems of a church that they would face if one of its church ladies and some of her children started accepting lies about Jesus and that changed the way that they lived? And they were. The lie that they were beginning to be convinced of, this lady and some of her children, was that Jesus didn't really come in the flesh, which is a lie that they were being convinced of. Can you imagine how a person would change from a believer to someone who didn't really believe that Jesus really came in the flesh? Just as it's true today, it was true back then that not everyone who claims to be following Jesus is really following Jesus. Let me explain that. If you redefine who Jesus is in a way that is not keeping with the truth of the gospel, then you're really going to end up following a different Jesus than the one that's described in the Bible. You know, there were lots of Jesuses back in that day. Even Barabbas, who gets turned loose, his name was Jesus. And so we have to make sure that we're following the right Jesus. And this woman was being convinced of a different Jesus. And she was beginning to change as a result of following that different Jesus. And she and some of her children who were being convinced that Jesus hadn't really come back in the flesh, well, they weren't really following him like everyone else at the church. And so there was this division that was going on. And if you're following a different Jesus, then you might start doing things that the real Jesus wouldn't approve of. And you wouldn't maybe be doing them for the right reason, love. It was a problem. It was a real problem for real people. The apostles did not write letters to people who had everything going right in their life. They didn't write letters to churches who had it all right. They wrote to people who had problems. It's not a sin to have a problem, but you have to let someone love you enough to confront you about it so that you change that problem. So we have to accept the truth that there were some things in this lady's household and with some of her children that just wasn't right. In this first part of the letter, John's big ask is that she and these children who agreed with her embrace again the commandment that we all know so well, that we love one another. I mean, we just sing it as a children's song, right? I mean, we want people to understand that as God's followers, we're supposed to love one another. And we can say it easily enough, but when it comes into our relationships in which we're having trouble with someone else, sometimes it's hard to do. It is a command that John emphasized in his first letter, which went to the entire church of Ephesus. But this one goes to just one lady who was having trouble. John's big wonder, just who were the we that she and some of her children who had taken her view of things were supposed to love. If he was saying, hey, you don't look like you're loving, you need to love, who is it that they had stopped loving? The we, at the very least, would include the church that she had pulled away from. The church that continued to accept that Jesus was the Christ, that he had come in the flesh. And it also implies then that some of her children held on to that truth and they still stayed a part of that church. And she and some other children were pulling away from it. Why would those who are pulling away from the church need to be reminded to love those who are still a part of the church? Because probably those people who are still a part of the church were trying to talk to them, trying to convince them that they were being lied to, trying to convince them to come back to the truth. In this most basic of commands, we need to be reminded that if we are the ones being deceived, we need to love those who are coming to talk to us. Otherwise, what would happen? If you've been deceived and you've pulled away and someone comes to try to talk to you about it, you might reject them. You might be offended by them. You may not want them pointing out that you are believing something that's now not true. You might pull further and further away. You might dig in your heels. You might be a little bit ugly to them. But Paul is saying, hey, your children in the church, they're coming to you and they're trying to talk to you about the truth. And I just want to remind you, Jesus' basic command is that you're supposed to love them. The whole reason they're coming to you is because they love you. And they don't want to see you pulled away because of these lies you're being told to. We really don't know how things turned out. We're going to get even more into the problem and the things that they were lied to next week as we get into the second half of this letter. But I'm just going to sort of jump to the end and say there was this tension that was going on. There was this lady in this household who were being told a lie about Jesus, and they were pulling further away. And there were people who were loving them, who were trying to go and talk to them and just saying, these guys, don't turn them away, don't reject them, love them. We don't know how things turned out. I like to believe that this lady and her children re-embraced the truth, that they recognized that they had been lied to, and they accepted the truth, and they mended their relationships, and they became a healthy church again. Part of the reason I like to believe that is because I like happy endings, but I also believe that the truth of the gospel is enough to break through the lies of Satan that separate us from one another. And that when we hold on to the truth, that we begin to act in love, that we are drawn closer together. But to be honest, it doesn't always happen that way. There are a lot of people who are so persuaded by Satan's lies about Jesus that they just can't tolerate anyone talking to them about the truth of who Jesus is and God's love for them. And they take offense when anyone approaches them, and they get further and further away. It's my prayer, my hope, that you and your children will always be on the same page, that you'll always hold on to the truth about Jesus. I hope that none of you ever end up being deceived, and because of that deception, being pulled away from the rest of your family. But I hear stories about it happening all the time. About how a child or a husband and a wife are separate from one another because one has believed the world's lies about Jesus. And whenever those who hold on to the truth try to come and talk to them, they get met with hostility and anger, and it seems to just make things worse. And so it's my prayer that for those families I am aware of where that's going on, that grace and that peace and that mercy that comes from the truth of the risen Lord heals those families, and his grace is overflowed and they become one again. I believe the gospel is strong enough to do that. I think it can change lives, and I think it can even get us over those deceptions that Satan is so good at. But hopefully we'll never even get to that point. Hopefully we'll just stay on the same page because we recognize the truth of the scriptures and we hold to it. We're going to have a hymn of invitation today. And if you've been needing God's love in your life, I invite